Picture a steel coffin. Not a large one, barely enough room to breathe. 5 men are packed inside it. The air is thick with oil and sweat, and the bitter sting of burnt cordite. The walls are vibrating. The noise outside is absolute. Shells exploding, machine gun fire, the grinding scream of metal tracks tearing across broken earth. The men inside cannot see any of it clearly. They peer through narrow periscopes and tiny viewports at a world that is trying very hard to kill them. And then, without any warning at all, it succeeds. There is a sound. Survivors always struggle to describe it. It is not quite an explosion. It is not quite a crack. It is something that arrives faster than the human mind can process. A white flash, a wall of heat, a pressure wave that hits every surface of the interior simultaneously. In the fraction of a second that follows, the world inside the tank becomes unrecognizable. Metal glows. Ammunition ignites. Men who were alive and thinking and afraid one moment are simply gone the next. And the lucky ones, the ones who somehow find a hatch and pull themselves through it and fall onto the burning ground outside, carry something with them for the rest of their lives that no word in any language has ever quite managed to name. This is the story they never put in the newsreels. The story that the propaganda posters with their gleaming steel and their heroic commanders standing proud in open hatches never told. This is the story of what actually happened inside the tanks of the Second World War when the enemy found their range. It is a story of physics and fire and human endurance pressed to the absolute edge of what a person can survive and still remain a person. And it begins, as all the most important stories of that war begin, not with generals or grand strategies, but with ordinary young men who climbed inside a machine and trusted it with everything they had. By 1943, the tank had become the defining weapon of the Second World War. Wherever armies clashed across Europe and North Africa and the vast frozen plains of the Soviet Union, the armored vehicle was at the center of it. Punching through defenses, exploiting breakthroughs, screening retreats, and absorbing the terrifying punishment that modern anti-tank weapons were designed specifically to deliver. The great powers of the world had staked enormous industrial energy on the tank. Germany produced its feared Tigers and Panthers. The Soviet Union churned out T-34s by the tens of thousands. Britain fielded Cromwells and Churchills across North Africa and then through Italy and into France. And America, with the industrial power that would ultimately decide the war, produced a Sherman in numbers that boggled the imagination. Nearly 50,000 of them before the fighting was done. But here is something the history books rarely pause to describe. Forget the technical specifications and the armor thickness ratings and the muzzle velocity numbers for a moment. Forget the battle maps and the operational objectives. Imagine instead that you are 19 years old and it is your first day assigned to a tank crew somewhere in England in the early months of 1944. You walk up to your Sherman for the first time and you climb inside, and the hatch closes above you and the light changes. The world outside disappears. What you have now is this: a metal box roughly 8 feet wide and 9 feet long with machinery occupying most of it and 4 other men filling the rest. The ceiling is close enough to touch without fully extending your arm. The floor is covered with ammunition storage bins and mechanical components and the personal kit of 5 human beings who are going to spend an unknowable number of hours in this space together. The smell hits you immediately: diesel and grease and something faintly metallic that you will eventually learn is the smell that fear leaves behind in enclosed spaces. Your job aboard this machine depends on your position. The driver sits at the front left behind a curved piece of steel that engineers have calculated will deflect certain calibers of shell at certain angles, though nobody tells you which calibers and which angles are the ones that will not. The co-driver or hull gunner sits beside him operating a .30 caliber machine gun and the radio. Behind them in the turret, which rotates above the hull on a powered ring, are the 3 men whose job is to aim and fire and reload the 75mm main gun. The gunner who peers through his sight and calculates range and windage and the movement of targets that are also trying to kill him, the loader, who must manhandle shells weighing 30 pounds each and slam them into the breech fast enough to maintain a combat rate of fire, and the commander who stands or crouches above all of them, observing the battlefield through his cupola and making the decisions that will determine whether the crew lives or dies in the next 60 seconds. These 5 men will live together in this space for days at a time. They will eat here, sleep here when sleep is possible. They will develop a communication so intimate and so particular to themselves that they understand each other through noise and vibration and the pressure of a hand on a shoulder in a way that has no civilian equivalent. They will become, out of shared necessity and shared fear, something closer than most people ever manage to be with anyone. And they will do all of this knowing, because they are not fools, and because the army has trained them well enough that they understand what they are being trained to survive, that the machine around them is not invulnerable, that somewhere out there other men are doing calculations of their own, calculations about armor thickness and shell velocity and penetration angles, calculations whose only purpose is to find the precise combination of factors that will open this steel box like a tin can and reach the men inside it. The contest between the shell and the armor was the central technical drama of armored warfare, and it played out with brutal consistency on every battlefield where tanks met anti-tank guns. The engineers on both sides understood the physics completely. An armor-piercing round fired from a high-velocity gun carried kinetic energy proportional to its mass and the square of its velocity. To defeat armor, it needed to deliver enough of that energy to punch through the steel before the steel could absorb and deflect it. The armor designers answered by making their plates thicker and angling them so that an incoming round had to defeat not just the stated thickness of the plate, but the additional effective thickness created by the angle. The same principle that made the sloped hull of the Soviet T-34 so much more effective than its raw measurement suggested. But the gun designers always answered in turn. Bigger charges, longer barrels, higher velocities, harder projectile cores. The race never stopped, and the men inside the tanks were the ones who paid the entry fee every time a new round of it began. When a shell won that contest, when it punched through the armor plate and entered the interior of the tank, what happened next was determined by physics that cared nothing for the human beings in its path. The penetrating round did not arrive alone. As it forced its way through the steel, it tore fragments of the armor itself, free from the inner surface of the plate. White-hot shards of metal moving at velocities sufficient to kill or mutilate anything they touched. The crews called these fragments spall, and a single hit could fill the interior of a tank with dozens of them moving in every direction simultaneously. A man might be positioned well clear of the actual penetration point and still be blinded or have his hands destroyed or be killed outright by secondary fragments before he even understood that the tank had been hit. This is what the technical reports called spalling and what the survivors called something else. Usually nothing at all, because there were no words that felt adequate, and because the men who had experienced it were generally not in the habit of discussing it with people who had not. But spall, as terrible as it was not the thing that tank crews feared most. The thing they feared most was fire. Every tank was a vehicle filled with fuel and ammunition, and both of those things burned with a ferocity that the steel walls could not contain once they ignited. The fuel tanks on a Sherman held gallons of high-octane gasoline, the same gasoline that powered the 520 horsepower 4JA engine that drove the tank at 25 miles per hour across whatever terrain the battle required. Gasoline in a steel box is already a source of risk without anyone shooting at it. When a penetrating round punched through and struck a fuel line or a fuel tank, the gasoline ignited, and the fire that followed was not a modest fire. It was instant and total, and it made escape not a matter of effort but of miracle. The ammunition was even more dangerous. A fully loaded Sherman carried 71 rounds of 75mm ammunition stored in racks along the hull walls and in bins set into the floor. When those rounds cooked off in the heat of a burning tank, they did not simply burn, they detonated. The effect inside the tank was explosive in the most literal sense, and it was powerful enough to lift the turret, a steel structure weighing several tons, off the hull and send it tumbling through the air. Men who witnessed this from outside described it with a kind of stunned precision. The turret rising on a column of fire and flame before falling back to earth, and the hull below already unrecognizable as anything that had ever carried human beings inside it. The Sherman earned a nickname for this tendency that spread through the Allied armies, with the dark humor that soldiers use to manage terrors that cannot otherwise be managed. The British called it the Ronson after a popular cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised it lit first time every time. American crews called it the Tommy Cooker, a reference to British soldiers and portable camp stoves that carried its own kind of bitter precision. These nicknames were not expressions of defeatism or contempt for the machine. They were the language of men who understood exactly what they were dealing with and had chosen to deal with it through a kind of gallows, wit that kept the knowledge at a manageable distance. The Sherman was a good tank in many respects, reliable, mechanically easy to maintain, capable of being produced and transported and deployed in numbers that gave Allied commanders strategic options that German production could never match. But it burned. The crews knew it burned. And every time they climbed inside and the hatch closed above them, that knowledge was present. Not paralyzing, but present. Somewhere behind the training and the discipline and the trust they had placed in the men around them. 30 seconds sounds like enough time. 30 seconds in ordinary life is nothing. Barely enough to pour a cup of coffee or read a short paragraph. But 30 seconds inside a tank after a penetrating hit was not ordinary time. The hit itself caused a pressure wave powerful enough to throw men off their feet and slam them against the interior walls. The smoke and fire that followed reduced visibility inside the tank to effectively zero within seconds. The noise was so overwhelming that voice communication was impossible. And the hatches, the only escape routes, were designed to be closed securely while in combat, which meant that a man whose hands were burned or whose vision was obscured or who had been stunned by the impact concussion might spend 10 of his 30 seconds simply trying to find and operate the mechanism that would let him out. The commanders and drivers, positioned nearest the external hatches, had the best chance. The loaders and gunners in the center of the turret had the worst. The statistics of who survived and who did not in Sherman fire casualties tracked these positions with a consistency that was not coincidence. It was physics and geometry and the brutal arithmetic of 30 seconds running out at different speeds for different men. June 1944. Normandy, the hedgerow country that the French call the bocage. It is nothing like what Allied planners expected and everything that the German defenders had hoped for. The ancient landscape of Normandy is a maze of narrow sunken lanes bordered by enormous earthen banks, topped with the root systems of trees and hedges centuries old. These banks are not fences, they are walls. Walls thick enough to stop a tank. Walls that channel every armored movement into predictable corridors, where an anti-tank gun can be positioned once and destroy everything that comes along the road until someone silences it. Allied tank crews who had trained in England on open ground had no preparation for what the bocage required of them, and in the first weeks after the landing they paid for that lack of preparation in ways that were measured not in tanks, but in crew members who did not come home. Sergeant Thomas Jennings of the American 2nd Armored Division was 23 years old in the summer of 1944. He had been in the Army since 1942, trained in the deserts of the American Southwest, and crossed the Atlantic, expecting the open terrain that doctrine promised. What he found in Normandy was something else entirely. He later described the bocage as fighting blind, moving through corridors where you could not see more than 30 meters in any direction and where the enemy might be on the other side of the next hedge or might be 3 fields away, and there was no way to know until something happened that told you, and by the time something happened that told you, it was already too late to do anything except react. On the 7th of July 1944, Jennings was commanding a Sherman moving along a sunken lane near the village of St. Lo when the tank ahead of him stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Instantly and completely, the way a vehicle only stops when something has gone catastrophically wrong with it. Jennings had perhaps 1 second to register this before the tank ahead of him began to burn. Not slowly. There was no slow about it. The fire was immediate and total, and the smoke that rose above the hedges was black and thick in the way that only burning fuel and rubber and the contents of a human life can produce. He ordered his driver to reverse. The driver reversed, and then the tank behind Jennings stopped too, and he realized through his periscope that there was another column of smoke rising to the rear, and that the German anti-tank gun, wherever it was positioned in the hedges or in the farmyard, he could not see, or in the ruined barn that might be anywhere along this lane, had already found its range and was working through the column with the systematic patience that was more terrifying than any amount of random fire could have been. Jennings did what training had built into him. He directed his gunner toward the most likely position of the gun based on the angle of the hits on the tanks he could see through his periscope. The gunner fired. The loader rammed another round home, and the gunner fired again. Whether they hit the German position or whether accompanying infantry eventually silenced it, Jennings never knew for certain, because in the confusion of the next few minutes, his own tank was struck. Not by the anti-tank gun, by a Panzerfaust fired from close range by a German soldier in the hedges, not 20 meters from the lane, who had waited for exactly this moment of confusion and chaos. The round struck the side of the hull low and slightly forward, and the noise inside was, in Jennings' own words recorded decades later in an interview he gave reluctantly to a military historian, like being inside a church bell that God decided to ring with a hammer the size of a house. The round did not penetrate cleanly. It partially penetrated, punching through the outer armor, but shedding enough energy against the steel that the spall it threw inward was severe, but not immediately fatal to every man in the vehicle. The radio operator took fragments in his left arm and shoulder. The driver was concussed by the pressure wave and slumped forward against his controls. Jennings himself felt something strike the side of his helmet hard enough to knock him sideways against the turret wall, and for several seconds he was not entirely certain what had happened or where he was. The smoke from the partial penetration filled the interior quickly, and through it he could smell something that he recognized with the animal certainty of a man who has been trained to recognize it: the beginning of fire. What followed in the next 30 seconds was the most concentrated experience of Jennings's life. He found his hatch. He opened it. He grabbed the radio operator by the shoulder and pushed him toward the commander's hatch, and he dropped out of the tank himself onto the road and reached back in and pulled the radio operator clear. And then he tried to reach the driver, who was still in his seat and still not fully conscious, and the fire below the hull was already through the floor plates and already making the interior of the tank unsurvivable. And Jennings, who was not a man given to theatrical self-description and who told this story only once in his life, said that he could not reach the driver. He said it the way men say things they have been carrying for 50 years, flatly, without decoration, as a fact that had long since stopped requiring any commentary, because it had been examined from every angle in every quiet moment since July 1944, and it was still just a fact, and no amount of examination had changed it. The driver's name was Private First Class Raymond Oakes of Louisville, Kentucky. He was 21 years old. He had a younger sister named Martha, and a father who worked at the Ford plant, and a girl he had promised to marry when he got home. He had been in Jennings's crew for 7 months, and Jennings had taught him every technique he knew for staying alive in a tank in combat, and Raymond Oakes had learned every one of them, and none of them had been sufficient for the 7 seconds between the Panzerfaust strike and the moment when the fire made reaching him impossible. This is the part of the story that the history books, with all their maps and their casualty statistics, do not tell. Not the tank lost. Raymond Oakes lost. A specific human being with a specific name and a specific life and a specific future that ended in a sunken lane in Normandy on the 7th of July 1944 because a German soldier with a Panzerfaust was in the right hedge at the right moment, and the fire was 3 seconds faster than Thomas Jennings's arm could reach. On the Eastern Front, the scale of loss was so vast that individual stories, like Jennings's and Oakes's, were almost impossible to individuate from the statistical catastrophe of the whole. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest armored engagement in the history of warfare, thousands of tanks from both sides collided across a front that stretched for hundreds of miles, and the losses were so enormous and so rapid that the armies on both sides were essentially improvising their responses to a situation that no previous doctrine had fully anticipated. Soviet T-34 crews were ordered to close the range against German Tigers and Panthers as quickly as possible because Soviet commanders understood that their tanks were outranged and outgunned in the open country fighting, and that the only answer to German technical superiority was to get close enough that it could not be brought to bear. This tactic worked in the strategic sense. It prevented the German breakthrough that Operation Citadel had been designed to achieve. But for the men in the T-34s, who had to drive directly toward German 88mm guns in order to implement it, the cost was paid in the most direct currency available. Junior Sergeant Dmitry Lavrov was 20 years old at Kursk. He had joined the Red Army in 1942 after German forces overran his home village near Kharkov, and he had been placed in a tank crew because the Red Army in 1942 needed tank crews more urgently than it needed almost anything else, and Lavrov was young and healthy and capable of learning quickly. By July 1943, he had been in 4 tanks. Not 4 engagements, 4 actual separate tanks, each one replacing a vehicle that had been destroyed before it. He had walked away from each of those destructions with different combinations of injuries and shock, and each time he had been assigned to a new crew and given a new tank and returned to the fighting because the Red Army could not afford to let experienced survivors sit idle while the battle continued. He knew more about being hit in a tank than most engineers who designed them. He knew it in his body and in his sleep, and in the way he flinched at sounds that other men barely noticed. At Prokhorovka, on the 12th of July 1943, Lavrov's 5th tank was struck by a German 75mm round that entered the hull through the lower glacis plate at a range of approximately 60 meters. The hit killed the driver instantly. The loader, a man named Volkov from Stalingrad, who had survived the siege of that city before being assigned to an armored unit, was incapacitated by the spall from the penetration. Lavrov pulled Volkov through the commander's hatch and dragged him across the hull of the tank and onto the ground, and lay next to him in the noise and smoke and confusion of a battlefield where hundreds of other tanks were engaged in the same desperate close range, fighting all around them. He could hear Volkov's breathing. He could hear his own. He could hear the tank burning behind him and the ammunition beginning to cook off, and he could hear the sound of the turret shifting on the ring as the fire weakened the structural integrity of the vehicle he had lived inside for the previous 3 months. He did not look back at it. He said later that he had learned by that point not to look back at tanks that were burning, because what you saw when you looked was something you then carried with you, and he was already carrying enough. The engineers listened. It took time, and it cost lives that might have been saved if the listening had happened faster, but eventually the lessons that burning tanks were teaching were incorporated into the machines that replaced them. The most important change made to the Sherman was a system called wet stowage, a redesign of the ammunition storage that surrounded the main gun rounds with a solution of water and glycol that dramatically reduced the risk of ammunition detonation when the tank was hit. Tests showed that wet stowage Shermans caught fire far less frequently than earlier models after penetrating hits, and the reduction in crew casualties that followed was measurable and real. The engineers called it an engineering improvement. The crews called it a reason to be slightly less afraid every time the hatch closed, and the darkness came, and the engine started, and the tank began to move toward whatever the day required of it. Other improvements came too. Additional armor plates were welded to the hulls of existing tanks at the locations that combat analysis identified as most frequently struck. The British developed the Firefly, a Sherman modified to carry a high-velocity 17-pounder gun that could engage German Tigers and Panthers at ranges where Allied tanks had previously been essentially helpless. Later production Shermans received improved 76mm guns that narrowed, but did not entirely close the gap against the heaviest German armor. None of these changes made the tank invulnerable. None of them could. The contest between the shell and the armor was a race without a finish line, and every improvement in protection was answered in time by an improvement in the weapons designed to defeat it. What the improvements did was shift the odds, incrementally but meaningfully, toward the men inside the machines. And in a war where survival was often a matter of margins that no individual could control, those shifts in odds translated into real human beings who made it home. Thomas Jennings survived the war. He returned to the United States in the autumn of 1945 and went home to Ohio and worked for 30 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant and raised 3 children, and was by all external appearances a man who had processed his wartime experience and moved on from it in the way that post-war American culture expected its veterans to do. He did not talk about Normandy. He did not talk about Raymond Oaks. He attended his veterans' reunions and shook hands with men who had been in other tanks and other lanes, and he drank a glass of something and looked at photographs and went home. It was not until 1987, 43 years after the sunken lane near St. Lo, that he gave the interview in which he described what had happened that day in any detail, and even then he gave it reluctantly, and he cried once during it and immediately apologized for crying, and the historian, who recorded the interview, noted in her annotations that Jennings had specifically asked that the recording not be played to large audiences during his lifetime because he did not want Raymond Oakes's family to hear it from a stranger in a lecture hall. He wanted them to hear it, if they heard it at all, in the right way at the right time from someone who understood what it meant. Dmitry Lavrov survived the war too. He fought in 5 more tanks after Prokhorovka, and by the time Soviet forces reached Berlin in May 1945, he had been in 9 separate tanks across 3 years of the most intense armored warfare in history. He was 22 years old at the end of the war, and he looked 40. He lived in the Soviet Union for the rest of his life, and he never spoke publicly about his wartime experience in the way that Western veterans occasionally did, because the Soviet system did not particularly encourage the kind of individual testimony that Jennings eventually gave, and because Lavrov himself, like most men who had seen what he had seen, was not sure that speaking about it would do anything except transfer the weight of it to someone who had not asked to carry it. He died in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and his grandchildren found among his papers a handwritten account of the Battle of Prokhorovka that he had apparently written sometime in the 1970s and never shown to anyone. It described the smell inside a burning T-34 with a specificity that suggested he had been trying to get it exactly right for 30 years. Perhaps because getting it exactly right was the only thing left he could do for the men who had not come out of the hatches with him. The tanks themselves have mostly returned to the earth. Some of them sit in museums, carefully restored and repainted, and equipped with information placards that list their specifications and their production numbers and the battles they participated in. Visitors walk around them and look at the thickness of the armor and the size of the gun, and sometimes they climb up and peer through the commander's hatch into the interior, and then climb back down and move on to the next exhibit. What the museums cannot display, what no placard can convey, and what no restored paint job can restore, is what those interiors smelled and sounded and felt like when they were occupied and moving and being shot at. The museums show the outside of the history, the inside of the history, the heat and the noise and the fear and the 30 seconds that exists only in the memories of men, most of whom are gone now, and in the written accounts they occasionally left behind for people patient and honest enough to read them without looking away. There's a field in Normandy where the grass grows thick and green over ground that was saturated with oil and fire in the summer of 1944. Farmers work it every year, and the plows occasionally turn up pieces of metal that the passing decades have not quite managed to fully absorb back into the earth. Most of these pieces are unidentifiable, fragments of this or shards of that. The material residue of violence so complete that it left almost nothing with a shape that remembers what it once was. But sometimes a piece comes up that is clearly identifiable, a piece of track link or a section of hull plate, or occasionally something smaller and more intimate. And when it does, the farmer sets it aside, and someone comes eventually and takes it to a collection point, and it is cataloged and stored and added to the record of what happened in those fields in those weeks when the outcome of the war, and with it the shape of the world that followed, was being decided one burning tank at a time. The men who burned in those tanks were not abstractions. They were not casualty statistics in a table at the back of a history book. They were 20 years old, and they had names and sisters and fathers who worked in factories, and girls they had promised to come home to. They had climbed inside steel machines because their countries asked them to, and because they believed that what they were doing mattered, and because the men in the tank with them were the most important people in their world, and leaving those men would have been a kind of death worse than the one that came for some of them in the end. They trusted the steel. The steel failed them, and the world they helped to save, the world that emerged from the ruin and the fire of that war into the fragile and imperfect peace that followed. That world owes them something that it has not always been clear it knows how to pay. It owes them memory, not the comfortable memory of heroic posters and gleaming museum tanks and narrated tours that end in the gift shop. The real memory, the kind that does not look away from the 30 seconds, the kind that knows Raymond Oakes's name and Dmitry Lavrov's handwritten pages and Thomas Jennings's apology for crying in an interview 43 years after the fact. The kind of memory that understands that the history of armored warfare in the Second World War was not written by the tanks. It was written by the men inside them, in the most permanent ink available to any human being. In everything they gave and everything they endured and everything they carried home in the silence that no historian has ever quite managed to break open all the way.